As I walk through the old streets of Edinburgh, I think about the persecution and killing of women accused of witchcraft. The historical records tell us that it could have been anyone. Relatives could accuse women in their family when they disobeyed or did not do a domestic job well. Ordinary people could accuse women because they resisted sexual acts or being raped. Some for simply being widowed and wanting to keep the land, livestock or few belongings they had. Any woman, for whatever reason, could be accused. This generated collective terror, and whole societies and towns were complicit in the murder of so many women. Civil forces and local religious authorities played a fundamental role in making the trials of women something of public ridicule. For example, in Scotland, the Presbyterian Church took seriously the Puritan religious crusade against female witches. Some of them were said to have had a pact with the devil or were accused simply because they refused to become Protestants and wanted to continue practicing Catholicism or a form of Christianity mixed with paganism. Similarly, midwives passed on knowledge to other women on how to retain control over their bodies and reproduction. This, in the eyes of the reformers, was not well received, and for reasons such as these, women were taken to the stake. The demonisation of women labelled as witches had much in common with anti-Semitism. There was talk of a Shabbat or a synagogue of witches. It was said that they conspired, like the Jews, to destroy Christianity and represented them, like the Jews, with hooked noses. The birth of the witch myth coincides with the birth of the printing press in 1454, where the idea that elderly women who were widows, poor, peasants, or who had some disability had a pact with the devil spread through books and pamphlets across almost all of Central Europe. This idea, this myth, was spread through what we now call Malleus Maleficarum, Hammer of the Witches, published in 1487. It was with the help of this text that many men from across areas currently known as Switzerland, Germany, England, France and Scotland began to interrogate women who matched the characteristics that they considered to be diabolical or evil in order to kill them. Religious and legal power, united in a single cause, warned other women to refrain from being rebels or healers, tied to the land and their pagan practices. Some historians comment that the witch hunt wiped out entire lineages in many parts of Europe, while others highlight the impact of the killing of thousands of women. The Italian historian Silvio Federici tells us that the witch hunt, like the transatlantic enslavement of African people and the conquest of America, was an essential factor in establishing the modern capitalist system, since it decisively changed social relations and the foundations of social reproduction, starting with the relations between women and men and women in the state. When poverty and famine drove peasants into the cities in search of work, women had to assume the responsibility of being providers for their homes, caregivers and educators in arts and crafts, so that their family system could continue in its struggle for survival. This is how the politics of care became normalised within the capitalist system as being an element related to women within the domestic sphere, while work and the public sphere continue to be related to men. Without the witch hunts, the modern capitalist system as we know it today would not be possible. Women's bodies, the constant violence of their bodies, their wisdom and their lineage provide evidence of how the resistance and organisation of communities was weakened by the destruction of communal land ownership, which caused the impoverishment and mass migration of a landless proletariat to cities and towns. The link between the nation-state and national religions expanded control over women's bodies and their sexuality, moralising every act. The result of the witch hunts in Europe was a new model of femininity and a new conception of the social position of women, which devalued their work as an independent economic activity and placed them in a subordinate position to men.
This period of witch trials in Scotland that spanned 200 years has everything to do with happening at a period of intense chaos. There was political chaos, religious chaos, and there was also civil war going on. Throw in famine. There was a mini ice age going on across Europe, so crops were failing. There was the plague. So the whole environment was ripe for fear.
The Protestant ministers were very dictatorial about what you're allowed to believe and how you go about believing it, and they believed that men were better than women, that women were inferior, that they were difficult, but they were also easily led, so they were easily manipulated by the devil. And the Calvinist Protestants in Scotland believed that Scotland was the most godliest country in the world, and certainly King James VI thought that he was the God, he was put on earth by divine right, and that he was the devil's greatest enemy, and therefore Scotland was most likely to be attacked by the devil and his minions, and being witches, because Scotland was such a godly country. We were the best at being, godly, apparently. And therefore everybody had strict rules and everybody had to behave the way that they expected. Women in Scotland up until the 18th century still had to wear, they weren't allowed to go out without their head covered, and they had to behave in a very sort of demure and covered, and know their place. They didn't have any rights whatsoever. They belonged to their dads, and then they belonged to their husbands, and so there was quite strict societal rules on how women should behave, and their purpose. So your purpose as a woman was to get married and have children and run a house.
There's a wonderful equation, if you like, that the Museum of Witchcraft in Salem has come up with, which says that fear plus a trigger equals scapegoat. Now, if you think about what's going on in Scotland at that time, you've got a whole load of fear, and a trigger, let's say something specifically happens to a community. The local community of Newhaven, for example, a small fishing village outside Edinburgh. There was a storm in 1643, and it destroyed Newhaven Harbour. Now that would have sent shockwaves to the community, because it would have destroyed their boats and their livelihood as well. So it's no surprise that during that time there was a woman from Newhaven, Helen Clark, who was accused of witchcraft. She was known in the community as being a bit of a big mouth, a bit quarrelsome. She would pick fights with the neighbours, she would stand up for her family. So she probably wasn't well liked. And it was very easy when you've got this fearful community, you've got something that's bad that's happened to it, to go looking for somebody to blame as a witch. Now, it would have been terrifying to be a woman during this time. There were young women who were married, there were young women with children that were accused of being witches. It would have been seen ungodly for you to argue, for you to step out of turn. And you can only imagine that the vast majority of women would have wanted just to keep their heads down and not bring attention to themselves. So through that fear, women would have been subjugated. They would have been kept in their boxes, they would have been kept in their place, and they would have been kept quiet.
In Scotland, as far as we know, there were 3,837 people accused as witches. And out of that figure, 2/3 of them were executed. The percentage that we can get to so far, from the records that we found, was 84% women, 15% men, and 1% we do not know the sex of the accused person. And in Scotland, if we think of the actual population at the time, it was about 5% of the population that this was affecting.
In Scotland, the Witchcraft Act came into effect in 1563. Witches became part of the legal system. You know, it was now illegal to be a witch. It was even illegal to consult with witches. And the punishment for that, it was a capital offence, so it was execution. It was the worst type of punishment that was available.
The Witchcraft Act in Scotland was in force between 1563 and 1736. Within that time frame, there were peaks and troughs when the witch hunting was more prevalent in various regions throughout Scotland. Edinburgh and the Lothians possibly had bigger impacts because there were more people taken there to be tried and executed from other parts of Scotland.
King James VI of Scotland, and then on to the first of England as well, he actually tortured people. He became quite heavily involved in the North Berwick witch trials, so he actually took great delight and determination in actually torturing people for confessions. Gillis Duncan being famously one of them. He wrote a book called Demonology, and it was a how to identify, how to examine, how to get a confession, and what he felt should be done. So it was a combination of the Kirk, the state, and the Crown working together to eliminate Scotland from all these evil witches.
From records, we know that of sort of roughly 2,000 people that were executed as witches in Scotland, 84% of them were women. Now that's a huge gender bias. So there's clearly something going on. And we just need to look at religion and the state during that time and look at the misogynistic beliefs and values that were just inherent within those institutions and which then filtered down into society's beliefs. King James VI of Scotland, who later went on to become King James I of England, he was obsessed with witchcraft. So much so he actually wrote a book in 1597, he wrote a book called Demonology, and it was basically became a reference guide to witchcraft and witch trials, how to spot a witch. And in it, he makes countless references to the fact that women, being the weaker vessel, were much more likely to make a pact with the devil, to sell their soul to the devil, and very often sell their bodies to the devil as well. You know, he sexualized the whole pact. So he had written this down in this book. This was the days of the printing press. This book was disseminated far and wide, and so this belief that women were more likely to be witches became part of society and part of society's beliefs.
Anyone who was slightly different, if a woman or a man knew sort of some herbal remedies, if they were able to cure a baby with colic, whatever, by giving them a tincture or drops, if the baby got better, it was seen as magic and it was wrong. If something happened to the baby, again, they were damned. They were damned if they did, damned if they don't. The fear came from everything outside their control. The control that was in the hands of the church, the clergy, the landowners, the king, that was then brought down in amongst the rest of the normal people, the villagers, and they were the ones who would possibly act against those that were accused by saying they'd done this or committed this or they said this, and as a result they felt that something had happened on the back of this. So good, ordinary people slandered and tainted by the dogmatic society that they had to live in.
Just one institution that was involved in killing witches. It was the church, the Scottish Kirk, which was an incredibly powerful institution at the time. And any accusation of witchcraft was actually made to the Scottish Kirk, to the minister of the Kirk, for them to investigate. Now, the minister, when I say investigate witchcraft, it wasn't a little chat with somebody. It involved incarceration, and it involved usually a group of men interrogating a woman for long periods of time. Once the church had extracted a confession from somebody using torture, usually, then the person was handed over to the legal system, to the state, and it was their job to try that person as a witch. In Edinburgh, it was usually the High Court of Edinburgh that was involved in that. So it was the very highest echelons of the legal system that were involved. I also think it's really important to look at who else was involved in accusing people as witches. It was the community. It was these people's neighbours that actually initially accused them of witchcraft. There's a local woman to hear Helen Clark, who was accused of witchcraft, from Newhaven, a small fishing village outside Edinburgh. And we know from records that there were 60 witnesses that were called to her trial from her neighbourhood. Now, this would have been a village of a few hundred people. 60 of your closest neighbours are called to testify against you as a witch that leads to your execution. So we have to remember that yes, there was the church, there was the legal system in the state, but also the community was involved in these people being killed as witches.
You would be accused as a witch by small rural farming communities, and you would be called by one of your neighbours as a witch. You'd have done something, I don't know, said something along the lines of, you know, you've asked your neighbour for some milk or something, and they've said, no, can't help you today. And you go, oh, you know, you say something, you curse them. And I said, oh, bloody hell, I hope your house burns down, you skinflint. And then they sort of said, she cursed me. And then there were rumours and talk, and then you got a bad reputation. The authorities, the Kirk session, would bring you in and question you. Now, they questioned you by keeping you awake for days and days. So they did a thing called walking and waking, because what they wanted was, not only had you been called a witch by the community, but they wanted you to confess to being a witch. And the best way to get a confession out of a witch was to torture them. But if you've been kept awake for 24 hours or longer in some cases days and weeks, you start to hallucinate, so you'll say whatever they want just so you can get some sleep. They also used to do things called pricking a witch in Scotland, where they would take a needle, but it was a really long needle, and more like a nail than a sewing needle, and they would stab you looking for an insensible spot where you didn't have any feeling and you didn't bleed. You've been kept awake for days, you were stabbed all over, you were generally brought in front of the Kirk session and the elders. You would be stripped off, you would have all your hair shaved, all over your body, and they would check all over you. So you were disrobed, humiliated, tortured, and then they would decide, because you've said, yes, I'm a witch, because by the time you've been tortured for 3 or 4 weeks, you've like, I've had enough of this, I will confess to anything. Then they would decide to, that's it, you've confessed, you've been called a witch, you've confessed, we've gathered evidence, now we're going to have a trial. Where you will be found guilty, so we will strangle you and then burn you at the stake. And it could have been for any of this, really some stupid things, you know, because you're known for talking to animals, not going to church enough, going to church too much, not having had children. So if you were a spinster and you were no longer, and you never had any children, you were seen as being suspicious. And if you talked to yourself and acted oddly, then people would be suspicious of you. That's how they would end up being accused. Just really mundane, stupid things like, you know, somebody falls over and you laugh at them. Well, oh, that was you that did that to me. You cursed me and I fell over. And these things could hang around in the community for years.
For those men and women who were accused of witchcraft and weren't put to death, it could have been that they were tried for lesser crimes, as it were, speaking out of turn, not going to church, things on those lines. You could say their punishment, if you want to call it, could be branding. They could be branded on the cheek. We don't know what kind of implement, but certainly something metal, something that would have stayed forever. They could have been banished out of their own village, and possibly even in other villages, because when you were moving between villages, the elders or the minister would actually write almost like a reference for you that you can take from one parish to the next. They would not be given a reference of any description, so they could be banished and they would be moving forever. They wouldn't have a permanent home. They would be ostracised. Nobody would want to speak to them because they've got this accusations hanging over their head, whether it be founded or not founded. So in a way, their lives were also ruined Obviously not as far as they were murdered, the ultimate ruination, but they certainly would have not had much of a life in their own village and surrounding villages.
The last thing you wanted was to be called out as a witch, because your life was over. Didn't matter whether you were burnt or not. If you were accused as a witch, that stuck. And you know, there are incidences in some of the Kirk Session records and the records of the trials where women have said, just kill me, because my life's over anyway. I will never get arms, you know, poor relief. The community don't want to know me. The research carried out by the Royal College of Nursing, and you can see this research on their website, could only find 250 women people that came under the category of midwife or healer or nurse in any form in their trial records. And out of the nearly 4,000 people, only 250, so that's not predominantly healers and midwives. Most of them were just ordinary folk.
But I think it's really important that we remember that at this time in history, between 1500s, 1700s in Scotland, people didn't use doctors. They couldn't afford them, and actually the doctors weren't that good. So they looked to people in their community that had knowledge of herbs, that had knowledge of childbirth, that knew spells and charms, and actually they were usually women. They were usually local women, and they maybe paid them, they maybe gave them something in exchange, but it was them that were used. And increasingly these women were viewed with suspicion by the church because they held power in the community. If something went wrong with childbirth, or somebody became a little bit more ill after their treatment, it was very easy to turn around and blame them, to point the finger of blame as a witch. You know, if you can use magic for good, in theory you can also use it for bad as well.
was various implements that were used to extract confessions. Can you imagine your fingers and your thumbs getting put into what's called periwinkles or thumb crushers? It could either be put across your fingers and bolts are tightened to each side and your fingers are all crushed. Or your thumbs could be put in and your thumbs are all crushed. So your hands literally are no use to you anymore. Then we'll go down to your toes and your feet. And you could put your boots on to go out walking today. However, the boots they used then, they were boots that were put on your feet. They were made of bits of wood. Clamps were put on them, and these clamps were tightened and tightened and tightened. So the bones in your ankles, your shins, your feet, your toes were crushed in these boots or booties. We then go to the women who maybe hadn't made their husband's tea that night. So they were made to walk around the village, led on a chain by their husband, wearing a scold's bridle. A scold was someone who gossiped and talked too much. So if your wife talked too much, you put this thing that went over her head. Made of metal, it had a bar that went this way, bar that went this way. Sometimes it had a nose piece, which restricted breathing. Sometimes it had bits over the eyes, which restricted sight. And it had a lovely piece round about where your tongue and your lips were, which was all jagged. It might even had something at the throat as well. And if you tried to speak, your tongue was almost pulled through these jagged bits, so there's no way you were going to be able to speak at all. There was also the heretic's fork. If you can imagine a tuning fork that you see people, tuning pianos, think of something on those lines with prongs at either end. And this was actually placed here. It had a leather belt that went round. It was tied round the back of your neck. So as I'm speaking to you just now, there's no way I could have spoken because this thing was solid and it was like that. So you had it.
If you've got 20 odd witches to burn that day, and the executioner has to strangle them all, he more or less garroted them, so he would put a rope round her and then a piece of wood at the back and turn it so they would like that. Well, you're busy doing that. By the time you've got to the 20th person, you're not telling me that person's as dead as the first one was, because that's a lot of strength to struggle 20 people. So they would get a stake. It would be on the outskirts of the village. It wouldn't be in the middle of the village or the town or whatever, because most of the villages were built of wood, and the amount of heat that was required to burn a body is quite intense. So to save the whole place burning down, they would do it on the outskirts, or as in Edinburgh, they did it near the Norloch, which is now Princes Street Gardens. They would get a stake 2 or 3 feet into the ground so it was stable. Yes, they would tie a witch to it, an accused witch to it, but what they also did was it would be barrels of tar and turf and coal, because you need an immense amount of heat to burn a witch. But they also would use things like dried out heather, because it's good kindling and it starts the fire. So not only did it take a long time, it would smell vile, but these women and men were dead before they were burnt. I'm not aware of any incidences in Scotland during the witchcraft trials where anybody was burnt alive. But I don't think, with the numbers of them being burnt in a day, that all of them were as dead as they could have been. The horrible images and cultural references of witches being old, spinsters, warty, as Liz said, to me just seems a wee bit like propaganda. They are something to be feared, and when you create a fear in people, they create this image of them, and you see it again and again throughout human history, where we vilify a certain certain type or a certain sect of people to justify the actions we've taken towards them by making them seem to be otherworldly, evil, dangerous. Women wore hats, they didn't leave the house without their hair covered, and that some of that was the style that was around at that time, so it could be that. There is no definitive answer as to why witches are depicted as that. Broomsticks are, again, it's like the cats and hats, everyday objects that are imbued with supernatural powers to make these scary people so that you've got to be on the lookout for them. It's propaganda. But there's also some stories of ointments that caused hallucinogenic properties like LSD that could be absorbed through the skin, and some of the best places to absorb this hallucinogenic substance was through the genitals, because the membranes of the skin are thinner and they would give you hallucinations of being flying and whatnot. But sometimes they would rub the ointment onto broomsticks and then sort of astride them so they could apply the hallucinogenic substance. So they would talk about flying on their brooms because they were under the influence of drugs. So there's a little bit of that, and then there's a little bit about mythical storytelling and how everyday objects become turned into things that became dangerous.
If we look at that formula again, fear plus a trigger equals scapegoat, you can see that that's still playing out today, particularly in our current turbulent political environment, whether you're talking about in the UK or in general and worldwide. There's fear being generated amongst the population. And a particular event, a war, an incident, is enough to trigger people to go looking for scapegoats to blame, and we see it today. We see it with immigrants being blamed, with certain religions being blamed, certain sections of society being told that they're too much. So we still see that happening today.
This plaque here is actually a representation of one of the 3 plaques that are on the accused witches trail, which goes between Couras and Toryburn in Fife. This one has 32 crosses, representing the 31 women and the 1 man who were put to death from the village of Couras. The second plaque is at the entrance to the woods at High Valley Field. Now, it's said that Lilias Edie and her coven, as they believed at the time, used to dance with the devil in High Valley Field woods. And here you have the depiction of Lilias and the devil cavorting. This third plaque represents Lilias Edie at her burial site in Toryburn. She died before she could be executed. The village didn't know what to do with her, so they buried her on the shoreline in an old wooden box under a great big slab, which is represented at the bottom. But even at her death, she still had the devil riding on her shoulder.
So it's very important that we acknowledge our past, that we teach people about the history so that we can learn from the past and not make those mistakes again. You know, if you think about William Shakespeare's Macbeth and the witches in there, the old hags, Tam O'Shanter by Robert Burns, you know, the sexy witch that chases him, even J.K. Rowling and her modern portrayal of witches. You know, all these stereotypes are pervasive in society. They appear in movies, in books, in Halloween, one of our big festivals every year. You know, if I was to show a young child, sort of age 3, 4, a picture of a witch, they would know that that was a witch just from what they were wearing, whether it's the pointy hat or the cat or the broomstick or the cloak or the cauldron. All these various tropes are just now inbuilt into our psyche as to what a witch is. If somebody was to turn up at Halloween dressed as a witch, you would know what they were. But if you think about where this has come from, you know, this is a kind of sanitized, almost kind of Disneyfied version of what a witch is that we're all so familiar with now. But it's come from a really horrible part of history. It's come from a really dark part of history that we don't really know that much about.
This picture here is one of the numerous representations of what witches are supposed to look like. This is another representation, and if you remember your Shakespeare from school where you had the 3 witches, again that's a popular representation and misconception of the old hag with the warts and the wrinkly face and all screwed up and horrible. However, the truth behind it is those women who were accused, they could look like me, they could look like Sheila, who's also been on this video, they could look like your mum or your gran, ordinary folk that you could see walking down the street anywhere. We have a video that actually shows Lilias Eddy being brought back to life, and it shows her starting as her skull and then coming into this woman who smiles at you just as your granny would if she was giving you your favourite sweetie or she was going to read you your bedtime story. So the hags are mythology. Your granny or someone of that ilk is the truth.